brothers and sisters, when you come into various trials and tribulations, as it is the proof of the pudding, as it were, qualifying the ambition of the adversary to engage in certifying you as worthy of the call. They hated God, they hated Jesus, and they will hate you. At which point, God's enemies and the United States enemies, which are foundational to this Confederate clan of wizards engaged in the terrorist insurgency, overthrowing the United States, getting their various false permissions through color of law and color of office, which do not certify as the quality of actually maintaining the position of any legitimate law, but is in fact the manufacture of Confederate espionage to infiltrate and overthrow the United States. The Nazi coup started by the FBI and others way back when in yesteryear qualifies the persistent contingencies to consistently seek the dismantlement of the rule of law as for the enforcement of Klan operations. At which point the use of them being targeting in their mechanisms qualifies the selection of everything that is valid in the United States and necessary to its function. At which point being on their hate list is a badge of honor, qualifying your superiority as they view you as fundamental to their enemy, the United States. Their terrorist insurgency engaging in the position qualifies their loyalties as Satanist insurgents to engage in the systematic targeting and dismantlement of all necessary to American functions. They having engaged in their contingencies for the reinstatement of their Nazi coup attempt, similar to in Revelation, engage in the position that the rapture of the church qualifies the position of the son of perdition being allowed to be revealed to the world with the absence of the church, with the absence of competent stability, loyal to nature and nature's law, created by nature's God, the writer of nature's law. When you engage in these functions and you remove those qualifiers, then they may debase themselves into the perpetual, unlimited evils day and night, as is foundational to their position. At which point, the insurgent terrorist operations, such as the MKUltra and the COINTELPRO, are fundamental to their foundational terrorist subversion in the recrafting against law and against order and against meritocracy. The public, in which you qualify the engagement of the public to do legal contracts, which is foundational American capitalism. With the removal of that capitalism, you no longer have capitalism, you have a function of wizard terrorism. You have Klan slave raiders engaged in lynch mobs, qualifying the destabilizing and destruction of property as a means of intimidation, the poisoning and disease spreading as a means of intimidation in order to gain compliance as a mechanism of war. The function qualifies their normal positions of disassociation to the Americans, calling them the civilians or some other pet name that qualifies their otherness, despite the fact that the civilians are the ones in charge as the primary authority. The consent of the governed is the authority, at which point the civilians is the civilian government, which is the lawful government, which is the Americans, which is fundamentally different to them, as they are KKK terrorist operators, engaged in the malice and subversion through the function of these insurgencies, stealing American equipment to systematically destroy the stability of the United States and its allies qualifying their engagement to develop the ultimate goals, which would include but would not be limited to the mass population reduction of the planet to 50 million, at which point the eradication of entire peoples is the extermination of entire countries. And this eradication of entire countries does not fear mad with Russia, as the position of 50 million people would not include the Russians, as they are systematically a part of a group targeted by Nazis specifically, who were crafted by the Confederates, who paid for them to engage in the blueprints and the development of these bigotries to have a higher aristocratic position other than the brutish clan, at which point you have the action of targeted races and groups and individuals who are, in Lindsey Graham's point of view, functioned through the military position of some sergeant or whatever, pointing to an individual and classifying them an enemy combatant, any group classifying it an enemy combatant, targeting a territory and classifying it to target as an enemy combatant, such as the territory of the state of Oregon, as this is a civil war, qualifies the position of their insurgent loyalists not being subject to the qualifier, as they have been insurgents, and as insurgents they are with the Confederacy, and thus not loyal to their office or to the Americans, at which point you have the systematic double agents engaged in the more malicious terrorisms and robberies against the public for the destruction of law, order, and property, at which point you have a state of abject chaos qualifying their perpetual pursuit of their Satanist ambitions, at which point their hatred is based exclusively and extremely upon who is qualified as the best for those communities. And as the best of those communities are the best, it is a thing to be proud of, because that is the thing suffered, the abuses suffered in their criminal targeting from their criminal war against the American civilians. It is against the law, specifically prohibited. They are specifically barred from their foundational national loyalties, which is the position of making anyone an enemy of the government without due process, which is foundational as one of the key issues in their Confederate customs, qualifying the use of obstruction of justice, where they would aggressively remove their cases which would potentially reveal their criminal secret equipment which is engaged in the subversion, as so that they could protect their obstructions of justice, so they could gain their false convictions from their kangaroo courts, which, knowing better in many cases, are actively protective of the criminal obstruction, at which point the criminal obstruction, as it is an illegal targeting system, qualifies it as an act of slave raid mechanism on the basis of guilt from nothing. The guilt is you are stabilizing America. That's the entire fucking case, and they'll engage in defamations and subversions and obstructions. Now, these isolations of targets for the disassociation of peoples being specifically barred, such as their barring of the use of the function of religion, qualifies anyone who is not in compliance with Confederate Satanism will actively be dismantled, such as David's church system, which, as a pastor of that church, would have engaged without the obstructions the majority of those societies and those people's connections, qualifying the stability of those peoples, which being a group of people who were already understood and planned ahead of time, were estimated and thus targeted as labeled for destruction on the basis of their relevance to David, at which point being associated to David in the original estimate is equivalent to being David according to the Confederate position, as it is an agenda of destabilizing the connections and networks specifically relevant to the definition of David, at which point you have the malicious destruction of the society for systematic genocide, with the conviction and prosecution of anyone who reveals evidence of these subversions, at which point their functional gaslighting terrorist mechanism is engaged in systematic, horrific genocides with unlimited qualified abuse under Confederate destruction of the Americans and their allies, at which point you have the basis and understanding of David's treaty with the Russians on maturity, from California's intention, which cannot be changed, and its agents, which cannot be changed. The intention behind them is dismantled if they are able to be voted out, which in many cases is functionally reality. But the position assumes that many of them would remain in their government. And their position of being in the government means they don't have a right to change their criminal intentions. Their attempt to obstruct their criminal intent is separate to their validation of it being in their educated final answer, at which point they aren't able to make the adjustments, in which case there were secret meetings specifically in place in order to certify that they knew better when certifying their educated answer, qualifying it as validated educated answer, despite the diversity of the position, as they are irrationally devoted to the destruction of the high priority targets such as David Boles and the others who are necessary to national security of these United States and its allies, for the existence of humanity not suffering that exponential trauma in the collapsing to the 50 million or exceeding that 50 million qualifies the ability for the Americans to latch on to their obligation and devotion to remove tyrants. And that qualifier inside the Constitution of the removal of tyrants is essential to everyone loyal to national security. If you're an American in the military, you have to be willing to arm for war, take your weapon, and shoot anyone in David's way. You, again, if you're a pilot of a warplane, you have to be willing to arm that for war and shoot these twatish bastards, systematically eradicating Confederate strongholds for the reinstatement of the rule of law, as that is your oath and obligation. Which brings me to the position of their targeting and dismantling of all masculinity. At which point, David Boles, as being convicted by the Confederates as the projected patriarchy, is the signature primary focus when considering the concept of the possibility of masculinity. And then one must ask themselves the question, what is a man? What even is a man? Is a man just some guy that was born a male? Was it a boy who grew up to maturity without too many traumas to their sexuality? What actually is the thing? At which point your assumption has to qualify the grading of the qualifier of what is pursuant to the definition. At which point the position would have to necessarily qualify the ability to engage in the larger risks and thus many of the rewards qualifying the active pursuit of expansion, at which point you have to be the leader of higher risk engagements, which qualifies in many realities the definition of the patriarchy or the man-led society, at which point you have the active position of what they believe about David Boles, which is their fundamental hatred of David Boles, is that he proves that through his masculinity they are effeminate and useless, at which point their positions of saying that they're better because of their education. Well, their education is worthlessness to David's obstructed education. David's obstructed education makes them look like they hardly passed grade school. If your engagement is the subject of wealth, well, we're wealthier, so we need to do so. At which point the argument is nullified because David is excessively wealthier than they are without the obstruction. At which point the position is not wealth or education, the position is Confederate loyalist or American or other. At which point, if you're simply a Klan member, then this accelerates your position as you are a part of a terrorist organization which is protected by insurgents derelict in their duty on purpose as they are seeking the overthrow and destruction of the United States. At which point the position is the entitlement to superiority on that foundational basis that you are an enemy to the nation you are seeking to rule or give orders to or have authority with or any of the other things, without any risk or benefit towards those groups, as they are an enemy for exploitation, for human trafficking, for rapes, for every other kind of thing. At which point the position of the Me Too movement, which is the qualifying position of selling in many cases the Feminist Incorporated ability to get revenge against men arbitrarily without actually affecting the rapists who are foundational to the qualified assumption of Me Too as the woman also being raped. At which point the woman also being raped qualifies their union in the engagement of their ability to collect all of their resources in the engagement of the retaliation against the vulnerability of the state of lawlessness which has been visited against them by the permits of them being raped as a permission. At which point the arbitrary abuses in retaliations and defamations against men in general qualifies the position that yes, all men except for the rapists are rapists. At which point, if the rapists are the only ones who aren't rapists, then they by definition can never become free or safe as a mechanism of their wizard spell, qualifying the normal trap of the KKK insurrection in these particular mechanisms, qualifying our obligation to observe the systematic position of their self-delusion and devotion to their own entrapment, at which point these entrapment schemes qualifies the complete subversion of everything that they publicly testify, as they are and have always been unrepentant con artists. And the position of not repenting is the position of not turning around. The assumption that many of them give, qualifying their justification of their abuse, is that God will allow me to become some kind of, deathbed conversion. At which point, if it is a deathbed conversion you're hoping for, then you would, on your deathbed, give up all of those things. If you would give up all of those things on your deathbed, you would give it up now. There really is no difference. At which point, the position is that you would not give it up at your deathbed when you are there moments from death. and someone asks you about the thing that you've repeatedly justified in your life throughout this entire time, your answer is going to be the same thing. It's not going to be, fuck you guys and peace, I'm out. You're going to continue to be the same old jackass loser you were before, years into the position of these criminal operations, qualifying their insurgency and infection of police, sheriffs, FBI, CIA, and any other group which is compromised as a devil agent. At which point you have the position of their systematic voter frauds. They target individuals and they say, such as Bill Barr's position, that if you're targeted by these terrorists from the federal permit system, then, you can be victimized by voter fraud. At which point your right to vote is revoked without a crime or due process or competence or legitimacy in any reliable sense. At which point you have the systematic dismantlement of the foundation of what makes America a republic, which was Mattis's position as a state of object goals for the Confederacy, which is the overthrow of the civilian government. At which point you have the pursuit of these insurrections, which are foundational to the position. Now, the lie from the obstructions and the illusions and the defamations and the replacements of reality so that they can jigsaw their way into a fraudulent argument through their kangaroo courts, through the systematic editing of all of the things, which takes into account their investment to their use of force in order to engage in the delusion and correction against reality, at which point the obstruction of justice changes reality into their fantasy, which is their stated goal of false justifications to their arbitrary targeting for the defamation enforcement of their terrorist insurrection, at which point you have the system in place specifically to engage in targeting someone for the exclusive purpose of removing their vote or influence on society, such as David Bole's character, who was targeted in order to remove his church, in order to remove his political party, in order to remove all of his economic securities, such as the zombie insurance, which is high scrutiny insurance, qualifies the advance at the first layer of all processes that would be in the zombie apocalypse community as having already profited off of any possibility of the damages occurring. At which point, if that as the first function of the position means if the product is going to collapse, then the total community is profiting off of it, allowing them to reinvest in the development of their foundation, qualifying the upgrade of the checkpoints and the comforts of their extreme zombie apocalypse condition. At which point, you understand that the traumas against the United States in the war effort by the Confederacy, such as ordered by Lindsey Graham's character with Mattis in the eradication of the Americans, viewed David as foundational to American stability and success and progress and all other qualities in the maturity of the United States as American. At which point the removal of the United States requires the targeting of those who are necessary to its people, at which point this is the foundational reason they have targeted David Boles and are in active malicious hatred against David and everyone connected to David, at which point David is targeted for all of these systematic vulnerabilities and terrorisms, as well as those that were projected to be connected to him. Those who are projected to be connected to him would mutually be vulnerable, such as the engagement of poisonings, such as the engagements of giving them cancer, and many of the other positions develop the vulnerabilities of the destructions of those communities, which are not collateral damage, as a foundational goal of the Confederacy is the reduction of the world population to the 50 million or lower, at which point you understand that our core problem is that the targets are necessary to the public, and thus the complements of America's enemies is their aggressions, their violence, their terrorisms, and their malice. Their unyielding criminal actions are proof and verification of the superiority of their enemies, who they hate because they hate God.